All right, today we're going to be talking about using oral history and interviews to learn more about the past. So generally when you talk about history, people think generals, presidents, prominent people that were famous. Well, history should be just as much about what the average person experienced during the past, not just the big people, the wealthy, stuff like that. Problem is that a lot of times average Joe Schmo, whether they just don't have time or they don't feel it's worthy, they don't get their stories down. They just never get recorded. So we don't know a lot about the day-to-day experience of, somebody that didn't have money, or the day-to-day experience of the average soldier in battle. And again, this stuff could be just as important as what a prominent politician or a prominent general experienced during a particular time of conflict. So what an oral historian seeks to do is go find people, while they're still alive, to get their personal perspective on past events. Go to them and basically ask them, what was life like being a soldier in World War II? What was your perspective for this battle? So this general wrote his memoirs. He said this is how the battle happened. Or the captain of the infantry company, he did his government report. He said this happened. He said everything was great. The company performed excellent in battle. So this is the documents we have. Well, what did you experience, Joe Schmo private, on the front lines? What did you experience, nurse, during the Spanish flu period? What did you think? Is it the same as what these guys are saying, the prominent wealthy individuals, the higher-ups in the military, or is it something different? Might not even be anything like a battle or major illness. Just what did you eat during a certain time period? We can learn a lot of important lessons, and maybe even more important lessons than you can learn from the prominent higher-ups from average Joe Schmo. Like, if you ask the average soldier what they feel about battle, it might be able to have you run your military more efficiently in the future. If you learn, this is what farmers grew during certain time periods, maybe that will make modern farmers, give them some insight into certain growing conditions. I mean, you can learn a lot just from the people that are on the ground, the people that might not think that they were important enough to document their story. So let's say you get in a project. You want to learn, let's go with World War II. Let's go with the battle in World War II. Again, you have generals' accounts, you have official military documents, you maybe have Congress, what they said about the battle, newspapers, what they said about the battle, but you want to get down on the ground. Well, you can find out there are a couple people that's still living that experience this battle firsthand. You got a vet, 98-year-old vet down the street, still cognizant, willing to talk. What you can then do is find a recording device and go get their story. Now, exactly how to conduct an oral history interview, if you're going to do it well, you probably got to have experience. But I'd argue, and I think a lot of oral historians, a lot of historians in general would argue, it's better to get something down than nothing. So if you can go find somebody, a relative, record their stuff, put it out there, that's better than nothing. But if you do have time, what you can do, and this will probably help a lot of people out, is just look up some general rules for conducting oral histories. I found one just Googling how to conduct oral history. I've only done a couple of these things, but you basically got to get some recording device, hopefully legible. I think our recording devices these days, even our phones, probably do a good job of recording than even like the most advanced recorder back in the 60s or 70s. But if you can afford it, get a nice recorder, get a microphone, something like that. And what you're going to want to do then is get some questions together. So let's say you've got a project you're working on. You want to learn about this battle. Learn about it. Learn what the official documents say. Learn what the commanding officer says. Learn what the newspapers say about it. And then see where the questions lie. Like, so commander says this, newspapers say this. What was your experience? Or maybe you're just wanting to learn about what was food like in World War II. Get your questions together that you want to ask this person, and actually get some extra questions together just in case you have some extra time. Maybe it's not your project, but maybe something somebody 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years down the road might find interesting. So you got your recorder, you got your questions. Basically what you'll then do, and this is one of these things, especially if you're going to release it out there, get a release form. You know, make sure, hey, is it okay that I record you? Is it okay that I publish this on the internet or whatever? Sometimes you're going to get people that will say, yeah, you can take the interview. I don't want this published until I'm dead. You actually go to a lot of oral history libraries, and you'll have these prominent politicians. They're saying how they legit feel about certain issues, but they don't want the public to know that until they're gone. So you'll see, here's an oral history interview. You can do whatever the heck you want with it when I'm dead, or maybe 50 years from now when my kids are dead, and they'll say that's okay. So however you do it, just make sure they sign off on this research form. Okay, again, background research is a good guide here. Create a question list, release form, and then basically what you're going to want to do is prep yourself for the interview. I'm not very good at this, so don't take advice from me as far as, listening to the oral history interviews I've conducted. You want to listen to these professionals. What you'll see a lot of professionals do is they'll ask the question and then they'll just let the interviewee ramble. Now, I shouldn't say ramble, because you're going to have to get people back in a little bit, but you're going to say, broad question. What did you feel about this? You're not going to say, what did you feel about this specific thing that happened at this specific place? You want them to tell the story, because they're going to be saying the things that are important to them, things that stuck out to them, and occasionally, let them go on. If it sounds like they might be saying the same thing over and over again, maybe bring them back in there, but for the most part, let them talk and say things, okay? Again, if you have something specific you want to learn, and you only have a certain amount of time, focus in that direction, but it's more fun to just let people ramble. You're going to want to make sure on this, as you're conducting this interview, to get the people's names, tell your name, and then write everything out. So conduct this interviews however much time you have. The ones I did were something like 2 hours long. Out of the 7 or so I did, there's only maybe 3 that are of any good, interesting at all. But you let the people talk, and then once you're done, you might have to transcribe it. Now we have this software today that's really good about taking words, translating it into into written form. But even then, you're probably going to have to go through and correct it a couple times. This is awful. I had to transcribe these things by ear. Took hours and hours and hours to do. But this is going to make things easier for everybody. Again, you don't have to transcribe it. Hopefully the software is there that you don't have to do what I did. And you might just have to, you want to put it up there in audio form. But whatever the case, a transcribed one is usually better than not transcribed one. So you're going to conduct these interviews, and then once you're done, you're going to post them in a location where other people can find them. Now, where can you find these various oral history interviews? One of the places that I always go to, always recommend, is Parole to Texas History. They have a couple of these oral history interviews, and what you can see if you click on this is a collection. I think this was put together by UNT and UTA, I believe, got together, and what they did is they just found prominent leaders in the civil rights movement. So this would be back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They found some African Americans, Mexican Americans who, protested, pushed for certain bills, things like that. And they found these people and basically said, what was it like? What was your experience like? Now, they were able to get camcorders. It was a pretty high-funded project. But if you click on the website, you're going to find the face-to-face interviews. For example, I don't know who this person is, Kathy Hartman. So this interview is being conducted by a guy I know is actually really good. And you got right here, it looks like the transcript's all the way written out. And the interviewer is going to be asking her a series of questions about civil rights movement. I believe that's what this project is. I believe this is part of the Civil Rights Project. And they're going to go on. So if you're doing research and this person's name keeps mentioned. Maybe you'll find the transcript for it. Maybe you'll find the interview with it, with the person. Listen to the whole thing. You get a very detailed personal story. Let's say you want to find general oral history project, but you don't know a location like Pearl, Texas history. Yeah, man, just Googling a civil rights oral history or the name of a certain topic you're looking for, you're going to find that people just post this stuff everywhere. So, for example, UTA here took prominent people with disabilities, and what they did is they just conducted interviews and put them all online. So if you're researching somebody, in just about anything, you can find them out there. Say this is for Texas, but if you want to do it for U.S. government, you can just Google this. All I did is Google oral histories for, I believe it was House of Representatives. Might be what I did, and this is all the oral histories interviews that are available to the public. Again, this isn't going to be all oral histories available for House of Representative members. I've seen some in oral history libraries, outside of this one. This is just the one that the history of the U.S. House of Representatives put together. So, perfect case scenario. A lot of times you're going to have to listen to these things. Sometimes you're going to be able to listen to them and see the person. But in perfect scenario, you're going to have these transcripts. These transcripts are searchable and not perfect, because a lot of times a transcriber will mess up a word or two. That can cause problems with searching. But if you're lucky enough to find a place with the transcriptions, like for example, this U.S. House of Representatives, the one they put together, has PDF versions of all of their interviews. You click on here and you look down, and it's got everything that the interviewer and the interviewee talked about. Usually these things are going to start with a basic summary of what the interview is about, biography of the subject, and then it's going to come down here and put this all in words. Now again, with the transcriptions, a lot of times you're going to have issues of punctuation. The way we speak isn't necessarily complete full sentences, so there's always going to be issues there. Sometimes when you transcribe them, you're going to cut out parts of the sentence, but for the most part, these things are really good, especially about getting a personal perspective on things. So these are great. There's an excellent resource. So the problem with oral histories is that we only recently had recording devices. Past 100 years, I mean, they're regularly available. I mean, you had them since 1878, something like that. But there's not a lot of people being recorded from 1878 till about 1930. We have a ton of oral history interviews in the 1930s, though, and this is one of these things that's really good. I guess I should say one of the only things that's really good about the Great Depression is that we have this project called the Works Projects Administration. It's basically WPA was this New Deal program put together to put historians back to work. If there's a depression, first people to get fired are clowns, second people to get fired are historians. There's not very much use for us. So the whole deal with the New Deal was we need to put people back to work. What do we do with these historians? Well, basically the U.S. government paid historians, threw microphones at them, threw recording devices at them, and told them, go out there and interview people with an interesting story to tell. So this WPA project, you had historians go to the houses of former slaves. You had them go to people that were prominent in labor movements. You had them go to American Indians that fought in the Plains Indians Wars. And so this WPA project comes up with, I don't know, thousands of interviews. Maybe tens of thousands of interviews. And you can find these things in libraries. You can also find these things online. Again, this is something put together by the U.S. public, so it's available for free. And I think the copyright's actually about to expire on them anyway, but it is something put together by the U.S. government, so it's available to the U.S. public for free. There's a couple different places you can find these WPA interviews. Project Gutenberg's put them together. I don't like the format they have. I've seen them in PDF form, which is better, and I actually like the hard copies of them. I think they're easier to search through. But here we got some that are actually put together by the U.S. government. Again, when we're talking about government archives, sometimes they're not as well put together. Usually the private companies are assembling things a little bit more better than U.S. government, but you still have these things available there. But this Project Gutenberg, for our purpose, I think is the easiest one. So you go there and you're going to find a lot of different these WPA projects. Right here is the Texas Slavery Project. Basically, you can actually get to this through the Wikipedia page, but you go down here and it's got all of these books that contain slave interviews. And again, this is for slaves, but you also have different projects for different groups as well. I just think the slave ones are most interesting because generally we don't have as much written documentation, because slaves generally weren't taught to read and write, so we only have a couple dozen biographies from former slaves. But we have, again, hundreds of these interviews, maybe thousands, maybe even 10,000 of these interviews with former slaves done by the WPA. Now, the problem with this WPA projects and that the people conducting the interviews, a lot of times they're not asking the best questions. You have a lot of people that are making these assumptions about slavery at the time of the 1930s. There was this general thought that slavery wasn't that bad, so you would get these racist interviewers, with this impression that slavery's not terrible, coming to interview these former slaves that by this point, this is 1930, slavery had ended 70 years ago, so a lot of these guys were children's slavery, and now they're in their 90s. Some of the people are in their hundreds when the interview's being taken. So you've got one, you can't remember things as well when you were a kid. Another issue again is that just when you're in your late 90s, your memory's not that good anyway. But taking all this into account, you do get some interesting perspectives on stuff like slavery. So this is just one book for Texas. I think on the last page it said there were 3 or 4 books for Texas. And we've got, I guess that would be, 100, something like that, 200 something, just for Texas. And this is a quarter of it, so we probably have a couple hundred for Texas alone. And what we can do is we can look, and these are just interviews. So people came in, they asked these WPA workers, 1936 or whenever it said 37, something like that, would come through, and they wrote down the person's name, 94, Elvira Bowles. This is just an example where she lives, family she was born into, and then it's her recording. Now, one of the interesting things about these WPA collections, some of the interviewers would basically write down the words that the person was trying to say. So this person does not do that. They write basically, I guess it'd be not colloquial, but they don't try to write what the person's saying. So instead of saying "I just remember," this says "I just member," which is what the person probably said, but again, it probably meant "I just remember." So you'll sometimes see people write it word for word how it was said. Other times they'll translate it. But right here you have this interview. Somebody stopped by the house, conducted it, and you've got this information about slavery you wouldn't have if this oral history wasn't conducted. Again, this is just one of the oldest oral history collections we have. We have other things like UNT. Oh, here's a folklore thing. I've seen UNT has a huge World War II collection. And again, this is just Texas stuff. I'm sure other places have different oral history. Again, it's just going out there finding it. These things, I should point out, they're not going to pop up just by Googling. You usually have to put name of the university, find out what the university specializes in. Like, for example, UTA, one of their big things is disability. UNT, Texas history, military history. That's why they have the big World War II collection. University of New Mexico. I was looking at that the other day. They were talking about to some Apaches about their life in the past, and you'd have somebody in their 90s in 1980 or whatever when the interview was conducted, talking about as a child going on to reservations and all these interesting things. So again, know that these things aren't going to be perfect. Not only you have the memory issue, sometimes people are going to kind of glorify as we get older. We kind of try and justify what we did in the past to make ourselves not seem as reckless or whatever. So sometimes people will forget the inconvenient details, only remember the convenient stuff. But again, if you combine this with other sources, it's incredibly valuable. And again, these oral histories can do things that other sources aren't able to.